A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So 1000 Shabbos at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide,
Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode has been sponsored in honor of the Shiurim of Rav Baruch Rosenblum, who is a popular Maggid Shir in Bnei Brak, who's been delivering Shiurim across Israel for the last 20 plus years. Each week he delivers Parsha Shiurim attended by hundreds in person and thousands online. They are deep and captivating, citing sources and commentary from across the Torah spectrum, Rishonim, Achrayim, Chassidus, Balei Musar, to down to our own generation's Torah giants. For the first time ever, his work is now being published in English. A PDF of each new shir is released each week, ready to be printed and sure to enrich your Shabbos or weekday spiritual Torah experience. Each shir will leave you amazed at what you discovered. It's exciting, interesting, engaging, captivating. It's an easy read and quite enjoyable. The breadth of sources from all over the place. There's something there for everyone. I can personally vouch for these shiurim. I enjoy it on a regular basis, and I believe that listeners of Jewish History Soundbites will as well. It's highly recommended. So for Rav Rosenblum's shiurim, you can visit torahpapers.com for details on how to receive this Torah treasure. Just to bring this out as an example, in the first 18 issues of the shir publication, there's been over 130 sources cited. Of those, over 40 of them appear in the titles of Jewish History Soundbites. In all likelihood, many more than that are mentioned in the podcast themselves. So there's definitely, the connection between the Torah and the history over here, and therefore go to torahpapers.com for details, and I will post the link to that in the show notes. Before we get to the subject at hand of the Aleksander Chassidic Dynasty in Poland, the prewar Chassidic Dynasty of Aleksander, I want to do 3 short tributes of people who passed away recently, and it's not going to be to Pele, the king of soccer, or to the Pope Emeritus Benedict, or even to Barbara Walters. It's rather, the 3 tributes are to 3 great tzaddikim who lived here in Israel and all passed away last week. First one is to Rav Mendel Atik, a special tzaddik, a Yerushalmi, who remained a Yerushalmi, yet with his simplicity and quiet way of doing things. He was one of the greatest Torah scholars in the world. He was a student of Rebbe Zalman Meltzer and Eitz Chaim. He was the last surviving member of the original 10 students who founded the Mir Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. In 1944, he was a very close student of the Chazon Ish and of the Brisker Rav, and he held various Torah positions of leadership in several different yeshivas around Israel and Yerushalayim over the years. Really a big loss, the last of a generation. Also, the beginning of last week was the passing of Reb Chaim Druckman, a senior leader of the religious Zionist community in Israel. He was the rabbi of the town of Merkaz Shapiro. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Or Etzion, the head of all the Hesder yeshivas, the head of the whole Bnei Akiva, a rabbi, a paisik, a political leader, a former member of the Knesset, a writer, a thinker. It almost boggles the mind how much he accomplished and led at the same time. But he was actually born in Kitov in Poland, today in Ukraine. He survived the Holocaust in hiding, and then his family escaped to Chernovitz, and then he escaped to Romania before making it to Israel. Also quite a personality. The third one is someone I actually knew personally, was Rebbetzin Shalamis Ezrachi, the wife of Baruch Mordechai Ezrachi, may live and be well, and she was the sister of the Mashgiach of the Mir, of Aaron Chadash, and I got to know her. I met her times at the Mashgiach's house. She, among her many other great things she accomplished, but she was also the author of a fantastic book about her father. So she profiled her father, the great Chevron Mashgiach Rameir Chadash, an excellent book, which I enjoyed a lot. And but she was quite a personality in her own right. She was very beloved in Beit Vegan, where she lived, and the wider yeshiva community. So those were three tributes. May their memory be a blessing. And now we move on to Aleksander. Aleksander Chassidus in Poland. It's about time we return to somewhat the bread and butter of Jewish history soundbites, some good old Polish pre-war Chassidic community dynasty. Haven't done it in a while. And I've been meaning to profile the story of Aleksander for quite some time. It's one of my favorites. So I'm glad that we finally have the opportunity to do so. And I'd like to open up with two amusing and somewhat ironic stories to introduce the topic, because Aleksander is less well known, even though it was one of the largest in the world, probably the largest in the world pre-war after Ger, or some would say the same size as Ger, or even bigger than Ger. There's a bit of a dispute about it, but I'm going to get to the size soon once we talk about it and why there's such a dispute and what the truth is, if we can even figure it out. But it's less well known today. It was very, very much decimated in the Holocaust, very small relatively today, because with Aleksander there's a bit of an irony or a paradox. They have this pre-war massive size, the glory, and nearly extinct today. Not extinct, but very much near that after the war, and has a little bit rebuilt in Bnei Brak and other places, but nothing like it was before the war. So these two anecdotes that I'm about to relate bring out in a funny or maybe perhaps tragic way what remains in the collective memory regarding this great dynasty. So the first one is a colleague of mine related a story about how either he or maybe a colleague of his, I don't recall, was interviewing a elderly secular Polish Jew survivor in Tel Aviv, completely secular. He had gone through the war, and he had even though he had grown up Hasidic, he had grown up as a Ger Chassid prior to the war. But he, after he'd lost his family, this happened to many people, their experiences in the Holocaust, and they, abandoned religion completely, and he was completely secular. Yet, on the other hand, he grew up in Warsaw before the war, and he knew the Imrei Emes, the Ger Rebbe, so my colleague wanted to interview him about his memories of pre-war Ger. So he goes down to Tel Aviv, and he interviews this guy, and the TV is on. And to respect his guest, his religious guest, he turns off the TV. So he said, you don't have to turn off the TV. I'm cool. You do whatever's comfortable for you. I'm a guest in your house. So the guy, probably just to kid around and tease his guest a little bit, he said, I turned it off. And he says to him in Polish Yiddish. He says in his rich Polish Yiddish, he says, Weil sie reden gegen the Rebbe's Aguda. They're speaking against the Rebbe's Aguda. In other words, the Ger Rebbe, which was Agudas Yisrael. So then the TV, the Israeli TV, probably some political issue in the Knesset, they were speaking against the Aguda. So his wife, this fellow's wife, the host's wife, hears from the kitchen. She's also an elderly Polish Jewish Holocaust survivor, and she hears from the kitchen, and she yells to him. She says, "You eat on Yom Kippur. Who are you trying to impress? You don't exactly care about the Rebbe's Aguda." So this guy leans over to his religious interviewer guest, and he says to him, "Was versteht sie? Sie ist von Aleksander." What does she know? She's from Aleksander. That's story number one. And that brings out the main collective memory that people have about Aleksander is the great war that existed between the two great dynasties in central Poland, the two massive, huge courts of Aleksander and Ger, and the 30-year war that they waged against each other. And unfortunately, that's what's remembered. That's one story. The second story is when I was in the Mir Yeshiva, and I'm a sociable kind of guy, so I met someone there, and I was schmoozing with him and asked him, about his background, where he's from, and it somehow came out that his grandfather was from Warsaw before the war, went through the Warsaw Ghetto, went through the uprising, Majdanek, Auschwitz, death marches, the whole 9 yards, and I said, oh, so was he Chassidic? What was his background pre-war? So he said he was from Aleksander. So I said, wow, Aleksander, that's, rare. Aleksander Chassid from Warsaw, who survived the war, settled down in wherever in New York after the war, and had this big, beautiful family now. I said, wow, it's amazing. So you're a rare commodity. So the guy, all of a sudden, his demeanor changes. He has this, fire in his eyes, and he says, yes, our Rebbe did not run away, with this, defiance and almost I don't know if it was triumphant or anger or bitterness. I'm not sure what the underlying current of the attitude was, and it was clear what he was referring to, the last Rebbe of Aleksander, the Akeidas Yitzchak, Menachem, Mendel, Danziger. He did not escape, even though he had the opportunity to do so. He was killed in Treblinka together with his family and his Chassidic community. And unfortunately, that was one of the reasons that the Aleksander community was not able to really rebuild to its pre-war height, both because of its decimation and the fact that the Rebbe stayed with them, and there was no strong leadership after the war, even though they did appoint a Rebbe, which we'll get to, but it was not the same as having their previous Rebbe who was before the war. So those are the two stories, and that's the collective memory, the decimation in the Holocaust and the fact that the Rebbe does not leave. He stays with them. He's killed in Treblinka in the gas chambers together with his followers, and this dispute that they have with Ger. So we're going to talk about Aleksander, and there's a lot of stereotypes, and of course when there's not many living members to tell the stories, so stereotypes are often as portrayed as reality. There's always the question of how much they do, though, and actually, are stereotypes just stereotypes, and reality was very different. And I'll give an example. Very often in historiography, Aleksander is described as a community in the social sense, in the social history of the community, as more working class Hasidim. They're more based in Lodz, which was a textile center, and factories, less elite, factory workers, the Lodz look kind of, as opposed to Ger, their arch rival, which was the wealthy, the Torah scholars. They're more aggressive, they're more political. Aleksander's less political, more simplicity, more Agudas Yisrael, and less elitist, like I said. So those are kind of like the stereotypes that people say, and they pass them off as if they were true. It's likely that these stereotypes are unfounded, but they were developed as their adversaries developed them, and they were developed probably as propaganda during the dispute between Ger and Aleksander. And when people attempt to paint stereotypes, and then these stereotypes are subsequently adopted by the respective communities almost in a sense of pride, and later on, that's what happens as it's passed on into the collective memory of both the survivors and of historians who buy into it, but it likely has little to do with reality. In other words, I'm sure we would be just as likely to find Torah scholars in Aleksander, and I'm sure we would be just as likely to find factory workers in Ger. Aleksander did emphasize simplicity, faith, love of fellow Jews, togetherness and unity, and there is definitely less emphasis on scholarship, which is what, at least in the collective memory, set them apart from Ger. The big question when people speak about Aleksander is its size. And people throw around numbers as if they know what they're talking about, which is kind of funny to watch. because it's actually impossible to quantify Hasidic communities before the war. I don't know of any barometer of measuring that. I'm not aware of, and I don't think anyone is aware of. It's nearly impossible to. It's possible to estimate the size. I'm going to get to what Marcin Wajinski did in a second. He was able to estimate it with a very creative way of doing so. But people throw around 100,000, 200,000, 1 million, or this or that. Obviously, these numbers are all exaggerated. Both Ger and Aleksander had tens of thousands of Hasidim. Both Ger and Aleksander were likely much, much larger than the third and fourth and fifth largest dynasties in Europe and before the war. Obviously, all the big ones were in Poland. The other large ones were in Galicia, Belz and Babov and Charkiv. In Poland, in Greater Poland, in Congress Poland, there was also Radomsk, which was quite large, but Ger and Aleksander were significantly larger. But it's impossible to quantify the exact size or the relative sizes. The Aleksander Center is Lodz, which had 233,000 Jews before the war, but most of them were not religious Jews, and even not all the religious Jews were Aleksander. There were many other. There were plenty of Ger. There were plenty of other Hasidic groups in Lodz as well. The main center for Ger was Warsaw, but again, there also most of the Jews, overwhelming majority, were not religious, and even the ones who were religious, not all were Hasidim, and definitely not all were Ger. So Professor Marcin Wajinski has a creative way of trying to quantify the size of Hasidic communities pre-war, and his research indicates that Ger may have been slightly larger, and I apologize to my Aleksander listeners for informing them of this. Not that much larger. His research is based on Stiebels, counting the size of Stiebels. He says if we take obviously, we take an average Stiebel, is if we average out all the Stiebels, if we have thousands of Stiebels, then they're probably all of an average size. In other words, there are Stiebels, the members of Stiebels are people who regularly daven in a Hasidic Stiebel. So there's going to be some Stiebels that are larger, more people, and some that are smaller, all across Poland, especially in the big cities. But we can assume that there's an average, and therefore, if we count the Stiebels, then we can know the approximate sizes, at least their relative sizes to each other. In other words, not their absolute sizes of numbers. I hope I'm being clear. How do you count the Stiebels? So his main source was Yizkar Bichelach, the Yizkar books that were written by survivors about their communities after the war. And he actually went through every single Yizkar Bichel and counted the Stiebels that were mentioned by the survivors in the various articles there, which is simply to go ahead and count it, numbers, and put it onto an Excel spreadsheet and see which one has the most Stiebels. And then, of course, there's other sources. There's newspaper reports, which he looked at about Stiebels, pre-war Yiddish newspapers and the press and stuff like that. And if you gather all that together, then you can get an approximate number of Stiebels. Obviously, you're not going to get to 100%. He told us that he got to close to 70% of all the Stiebels in Poland, which is an incredibly high number. And he said his favorite part was when he published his findings and he was criticized by different Hasidic communities. How'd you forget about this Stiebel? How'd you forget about that Stiebel? You didn't do good research. You didn't mention this Stiebel. And he said that was the best part of it because now he had more information. These people were able to inform him of other Stiebels that he didn't know about. And the fact that they were only able to find a handful showed how good his research was. So the criticism was the best part. The Stiebel research indicates that Ger may have been slightly larger than Aleksander, and everything else was far behind that. Radomsk and Belz and Babov and all the others. Obviously, out of Poland, the Hasidic communities are much smaller, but we're talking about in Poland itself. So, Aleksander's origins are in Peshischa, like most Polish Chassidic dynasties. Vorka, the official pre-founder, not even the founder, the pre-founder is Rav Danziger of Gritza. He was a student of Peshischa, And it comes through this Vorka side. There is a old Rebbe of Aleksander. They call him Alter Rebbe Aleksander. It has no connection to this. It's connected more to Kotsk and Ger. Rebbe Chanech Henech Levin, the Alter Rebbe of Aleksander, he's actually the ancestor of the prominent Ger Levin family. He just happened to live in Alexander, but he has no connection to the Alexander dynasty that we are talking about. This Alter Rebbe of Alexander, Rebbe Chanech Henech Levin, was the Rebbe for 4 years following the Chidushei Harim's passing in 1866, before the Sfas Emes assumed the mantle of leadership of Ger in 1870, and this has zero connection to the Alexander dynasty that we're discussing. So just wanted to clarify that. So there's this idea in the early Chassidic times, especially in Poland in the 19th century, of non-dynastic succession. In early Polish Hasidim and in Peshischa, there's long after there's already dynastic succession in Hasidic Ukraine, in Hasidic Belarus, in Hasidic Lithuania. In Poland, there's still non-dynastics. It's meritocracy. In fact, there was already dynastic succession in Volozhin. So the Litvaks and their yeshivas had already adopted dynastic succession in the yeshiva in Volozhin, and yet Polish Hasidim, which are usually the ones blamed for the dynasty thing, had not yet adopted that mode of a succession of leadership. It was still a meritocracy. So there goes another myth that it only came later on to the Litvaks. It actually was first by the Litvaks and only later on to the Polish Hasidim. So the Alexander dynasty needs to be seen in the context of Polish Hasidus, because following the passing of Reb Simcha Bunim of Peshischa in 1827, the Peshischa community split. The majority went to Kotsk, and with the Kotsker, and the minority goes to the son of Reb Simcha Bunim of Peshischa, Rav Yehuda Moshe, who passed away a few months later, and he was succeeded by one of the prime students of Reb Simcha Bunim of Peshischa, Reb Yitzchak Kalish, Reb Yitzchak Vorka. In the town of Vorka, suburb of Warsaw, been there a couple of times on trips. On the other hand, there are those who say that, posit that a majority of the Peshischa followers ended up on the Vorka side, and only a minority went to Kotsk. So it's a big question. The split in Peshischa between Vorka and Kotsk is later on going to be echoed in the Alexander and Ger wars, but this Vorka and Kotsk split wasn't that exciting. Either way, the question is, it wasn't really to Kotsk, first of all. It was to Tomashov. He only moved to Kotsk a couple of years later, but that's a good discussion for another time. Was there more who went to Vorka or more who went to Kotsk? There are certainly several prominent Peshischa disciples who went to the Vorka side, including Reb Shaga Feivel Danziger of Gritza, who's kind of like the pre-patriarch of the Alexander dynasty, under discussion here now. Also, Reb Yaakov Aryeh Guterman, the Radz of Radzamin, who was also buried in the Warsaw Cemetery that we go to, and several others. If we'd summarize the Chassidic world of central Poland in the early 20th century, it would be possible to generalize by noting that there's three clusters of Chassidic groupings. There's the non-Peshischa Chassidic dynasties, such as Radomsk, Kuznets, Muzhitz, and others. There's the Kotsk Peshischa dynasties, such as Kotsk, which includes Pilov and Lukov, and there's Sakhachev, Chekhanov, Pilz, Gustinin, Izhbitz, Radzin, Lublin, and of course, the main one, the most prominent one, is Ger and several others. The third cluster was the Peshischa Vorka cluster of dynasties, which included Vorka, Amshinov, Aleksander, Strikov, Radzamin, Skarnovich, and several others. Biala is somewhere in there as well, either on the Kotsk side or the Vorka side, I don't remember offhand. So Alexander comes from the Vorka side, which is considered the more calm or moderate or more loving, more less extreme, however you want to use your PC term to describe it. That's the Vorka one, as opposed to Ger, the Kotsk Ger, which is the more sharp and less calm, we'll say. So following the passing of Rebbe Yitzchak of Vorka in 1848, parenthetically, he's a fascinating person and leader of Polish Jewry who will have to do something on him one day. He's an amazing personality. But Rebbe Yitzchak of Vorka is succeeded by his close friend, Reb Shaga Feivel Danziger of Gritza, who subsequently passes away a half a year later, and it reverts back to the children of Rav Yitzchak of Vorka, and later on to Rav Dov Berish Landa of Biala. Later on, Strikov comes from that, and upon the latter's passing in 1876, most of the Vorka followers turned to the son of Reb Shraga Feivel of Gritz, Reb Yechiel Danziger, and he assumed the leadership of the primary Vorka community in central Poland. It's interesting to note that it sounds like there's sons and fathers here, but it's not exactly dynastical succession because it goes back and forth to different students and different families and only comes back to the son later on. But of course, this is soon to change because now this is the founding of the Aleksander Dynasty, and it goes straight father to son after that. Rabbi Yechiel Danziger serves as community rabbis. He was an accomplished Torah scholar, not only a Chassidic leader. He was a rabbi of several communities until he eventually settled in a Lodz suburb called Aleksander, Aleksandrow in Polish. Rabbi Yechiel is considered the father of the Aleksander Dynasty. It would remain a Lodz-based Chassidus until its demise in the Holocaust. In the 1870s, Lodz hadn't yet emerged as the massive urban industrial sprawl with its incredibly large Jewish population it was later to become. In the 1870s, there was less than 10,000 Jews in Lodz, which is already quite sizable. It's not a little shtetl. But by the time the war broke out in 1939, there were 233,000 Jews living in Lodz, and it was second only to Warsaw in its size of in Jewish Poland. So it was a massive, huge Jewish community, industrial, textile industry. It was a major factory center and very urban, and Lodz is a good story also. So Rabbi Yechiel served at the helm in Aleksander until his passing in 1894, and he's succeeded by his son Rabbi Yisrael Yeshiva Danziger, known later on by his sefer, the Yismach Yisrael. One of the most interesting rabbis of his day. He served the Aleksander community from 1894 until his passing in 1910. He never had children. He actually had a childlike look himself. He had no facial hair. Very interesting. People would be like in awe of him. He had this incredible personality, very strong leader. Aleksander began to grow and emerge as one of the larger Hasidic communities of central Poland under his leadership. And when he passes away childless, he obviously couldn't be succeeded by a child, so he's succeeded by his younger brother, Rav Shmuel Tzvi Danziger, the Tiferes Shmuel. And he established the first Alexander Yeshiva, and one of the earliest Chassidic yeshivas in Poland altogether, and he named it Bais Yisrael in memory of his childless brother, the previous Rebbe. So he and the Tiferes Shmuel and his brother, the Yismach Yisrael, and the father, the Rabbi Yechiel, are all buried in Aleksander, along with another third brother named Rabbi Tzali Yoyer, who stayed in Lodz, and he was a leader of the Aleksander Shtibels within the city, with his, managed it for his brother. He's also buried in Aleksander when he passed away in 1934. In 1923, the Tiferes Shmuel passes away and is succeeded by his son, the last pre-war Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Menachem Mendel Danziger, who's later on, after he's killed in Treblinka during the Holocaust, the title of his work is given as Akeidas Yitzchak, which was very apropos due to his martyrdom in Treblinka. So he was actually briefly profiled on Jewish History Soundbites a few years ago on a Tisha B'Av podcast dedicated to great Torah leaders murdered in the Holocaust. So you might want to check that episode out. It's an old episode, but I spoke a little bit about him there. And it was under his watch, Rabbi Yitzchak Menachem Mendel, that Aleksander reaches its full glory. It was the largest in Poland, and and hence the world, along with Ger, obviously, which was slightly larger, its arch rival. It had this impressive, Aleksander at this time had this impressive network of shtiblach and yeshivas, Bais Yisrael. The Bais Yisrael Yeshiva wasn't just one or two in Aleksander and Lodz. It became this yeshiva network. Tens of thousands of Hasidim would converge on the court for the Yom Ne'Roim and other special occasions. Its urban center in Lodz made it easily accessible. It's a suburb. Ger, of course, has Warsaw. Tens of thousands of followers, a huge community. It's initially apolitical, which was very unique for Polish Jews at the time. Later on, towards the end of the interwar period, it joins the Aguda. The Rebbe actually attended the third Knessia Gedola of Agudas Yisrael in Marienbad in Czechoslovakia. But very often, the political stance of Alexander was just to be anti-Ger. That was the way they decided their politics. Ger was associated with Aguda, so therefore Alexander wasn't. It was more noticeable by local elections. Alexander would run on separate tickets, just not to be running with Ger. For a short time, Alexander even identified with Mizrahi, religious Zionism, seemingly not because of any identification with Zionism per se, which would have been very rare for Polish Hasidim at the time, but rather seemingly just to spite Ger. Later on, they quickly disassociated with Mizrahi, and they were just apolitical altogether. And then, of course, like I said, towards the end, when the dispute was resolved, shortly before the war, they did join Agudas Yisrael. And like I'm alluding to the whole time, one of the most famous stories about the Alexander Dynasty was its long war with its rival in Poland, Ger. It's the two largest, most prominent and influential courts, and they embark on this 30-year war. The 30-year war commences in 1907, and it is not resolved by the Peace of Westphalia like the original 30 Years' War in the 1648, I think it ended, with the Catholics and Protestants in Central Europe. That's a different story. This is Ger and Alexander in the 20th century. It was mostly about control in smaller Polish towns outside of Lodz and Warsaw, rabbinical appointments, sheichtim, other functionaries in the kahals, in the religious communities. And there was an attempt at peacemaking by the Chavetz Chaim. Chavetz Chaim, who's universally respected, and he also was a lover of peace. He attempted to broker a peace agreement, I don't know if it was in Geneva, and I don't know if it was called the Abraham Accords, but he attempted, and he was almost as successful as some of the peace treaties in the Middle East. In other words, he was not successful at all in brokering any peace treatment, and the war continued until it kind of resolved itself in the late 1930s. I want to read a passage of a memoir that was written about the dispute, just to give a little bit of a flavor. It's a little colorful, a little bit not PC. I hope no one's offended. But I think it's a little bit interesting, for historical, someone who was an eyewitness, someone who lived at the time. First of all, it starts, before I get to the passage, it starts at what instigates it is in 1907 in the town of Zdunska Wola, not far from Lodz, a rabbinic dispute. Who's going to become the rabbi of the community? Everyone's trying to exercise control and expand their base of operations and have political influence and religious influence and control over different smaller communities around Poland, around central Poland. So these conflicts were about positions, about functionaries, about sheichtim and things like that, which would give more control. So the passage I want to read reads as follows. Each would belittle the other, and neither spared the other any barbs. Alexander called Ger's self-confidence insolent and behavior befitting adolescent Gentiles, but they were somewhat scared of their rival's confidence and sense of authority. Ger followers always behaved everywhere they went with a confident arrogance and conceit, while disparaging followers of other Hasidic factions. They conversed in their own rapid and erudite dialect, swallowing half-words, praying and speaking in a unique sing-song way, grimacing and making unusual bodily gestures of their own and inclining their heads to one side as if they were gestures of humility. But hidden within this meekness was a sense of contempt for everyone, everything and everyone. All the minor and insignificant Hasidic sects in Poland talked about this in secret with jealousy and bitterness, but they still felt themselves subjects of Ger and kept cover in their hiding places. Followers of Alexander were too numerous to demote themselves to the rank of subjects of Ger, however, but they were too weak to be of familiar stature as Ger, or to be able to ever win them in battle. Followers of Alexander always opposed Ger, and they always lost. That's why Alexander followers always clenched their fists in front of followers of Ger's. They snarled at them, they blamed them for being rude, and once in a while they would quietly joke about the Rebbe of Ger. the people of Ger remained undefeated. The attitude of Ger followers towards those of Aleksander, as was noted, was most insulting. They considered Aleksander to be a bunch of loafers, Jews who loved alcohol but engaged in very little Torah learning. Most of all the followers of Ger liked to poke fun at the Aleksander, the personality of the Aleksander Rebbe. That's the end of that passage. It's very non-flattering, and unfortunately, it's a tragic episode. It went international. It went to national scale. It went to international into the land of Israel. It went into Polish politics, non-Chassidic Jewish politics, Polish non-Jewish politics, and it got all over the place. So it was quite a tragic story. But that really brings it out in a colorful way, even if it makes one feel uncomfortable, the way Jews treated each other, religious Jews treated each other at times during these rather not fun disputes, rather sad disputes that took place in the politics of interwar Jewish Poland. Of course, the memoir is describing the followers, not the great tzaddikim themselves, and that's important to note as well. In the Holocaust, as one of the most prominent leaders of Polish Jewry, the Rebbe, Rebbe Menachem Mendel, the Akeidas Yitzchak, he appeared on the cover of one of the issues of the Nazi anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, Julius Streicher. So the Rebbe left Aleksander and goes in the beginning of the war to Lodz, and he then escapes to Warsaw. He remained in the Warsaw Ghetto. He had an opportunity to escape to the land of Israel, but he refused to abandon his followers. He chose to stay with them and share their fate. He was employed in the famous Schultz shop of Avram Mendel, who ironically was a Ger Chassid, until he was deported to Treblinka, and he was killed upon arrival in the gas chambers there along with his entire family and his followers, all his Chassidim, during the great deportation in the summer of 1942. With the exception of a couple of children of his who had died young before the war, all of the Aleksander Rebbe's children and grandchildren were killed in the Holocaust, mostly in the Treblinka death camp. Aleksander was decimated. The family of the Rebbe himself, the Chassidim, the communities, Central Poland and its Chassidic dynasties, mostly, were gone. There was a somewhat of a resurgence in Bnei Brak after the war. Many years earlier, there was a close follower of the Bais Yisrael of Aleksander named Rav Yehuda Moshe Tyberg. He came from a prominent Aleksander family. He eventually married the daughter of the younger brother of the Aleksander Rebbe, who I mentioned previously, the previous Aleksander Rebbe, his younger brother, Rebbe Danziger. So it made this Rav Yehuda Moshe Tyberg a nephew of the previous Rebbe and a first cousin of the martyred Rebbe. And he lived in Lodz, and he engaged in a wine business. And despite his association and marriage into the Aleksander family, he also maintained a relationship with other great tzaddikim of his day, including Belz and Charkiv in Galicia, also Merichil Hallstatt, the Ostrovtzer Rebbe in Poland. He spent some time in England, later the United States also. He moves to Palestine in 1934. He lived very simply in Yerushalayim, and following the war, as the only prominent family member of the Aleksander Rebbe to remain alive, so he was asked by Aleksander's survivors in 1947 to attempt to rebuild the dynasty. He moves to Bnei Brak and he embarks on rebuilding a shul, a shtibel, a yeshiva, a court, a dynasty, a community. Limited success, but some success, and he even changed his name to his wife's maiden name of Danziger to preserve the Rebbe's family name. Most of his own family had also stayed behind in Poland and were killed as well. But he had one son who had moved with him. He served until his passing in 1973, and then he's succeeded by that son who had moved with him in the 1930s, Rebbe Menachem Danziger, and under his more than 3 decades as leader of the Aleksander community, it did witness modest expansion, and he opened several shtibels in Israel, the United States, and beyond. When he passed away in 2005, his son is the current Rebbe. He's the first one not born in Poland. He's born in Israel, Rabbi Yisrael Tzvi Danziger, and he has his court based in Bnei Brak. So this was the Aleksander Dynasty. This is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.